Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Theolog. I forgot my camera again, so you guys have to put up with this angle that I hate so much. But anyway, I wanted to make a Theolog today about the new heresy, a new heresy alert. But I mean, it's actually not really a new one. It's actually kind of an old one, but one that needs to be rejected all the same. It just goes by a different name now because that's what people do is they just give the old bad ideas new names and see if they can catch on, which they usually do for a while until it gets too big and then we are like, oh no, we let it happen. So anyway, I wanted to talk about kinism. So this is the new big thing. I mean, like, always when you say big, you have to put these things into perspective. Like, it gets a lot of traction online, but how many people actually believe in this is probably very few. But it's growing in number, especially among people who, I guess you would say, are definitely on the more conservative side of the Christian spectrum in the United States. And it's called kinism, and what it says is it basically is big on nations. And what that means is it takes the Greek word ethnos, which is where we get our word ethnicity, but is usually translated as nation in the Bible, at least in the Greek New Testament. And it says, there were these nations that are created, and they've all been made very specifically, and these nations are good, and these nations should be kept separate from one another, right? And so one of the big things that is here is obviously you already see maybe the tension or the strangeness in this sort of thinking, which is that, yes, God has created a bunch of different nations, but these nations aren't supposed to be together, and they aren't supposed to be, especially in the case of many, intermarrying with one another. And this is not like a deep dive into this, right? I'm not buying their books or going through all these articles and things like that, but I just, from what I've been able to parse and see on Twitter, and from other sources that I've looked at, just as this is kind of a big thing for a lot of these people. And so, of course, this doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Like, it's not like they're completely without biblical evidence for this sort of thing. So, for instance, one of the places they'll turn is in Deuteronomy 7. Now, Deuteronomy is one of the five books of Moses. It's the last book of Moses. It's the second law, and it's the second reading of the law and giving of the law before the people of Israel go into the promised land, right? So that's important to remember, that this is the context that it was written in. So this is the part that is usually cited, and so this is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. So this is from the English Standard Version. And it says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons." And obviously there's a lot to unpack there, right? I mean, this is like one of those things that there's a lot to think about. But the focus obviously is that, hey, don't go, you're going into this land, you need to wipe out the people that are there because they are degenerate and evil, and they do terrible things, which is true. These nations did do these things. Of course, that doesn't happen, right? They enter and they don't obey what God has to say, and that ends up really harming the people quite a bit. But of course, the focus, I guess, for a lot of kinists here is actually on that verse 3, right, where it says, "Do not intermarry with them, or do not give away your daughters or sons in marriage to them," right? Now, the thing that is usually left out, right, and I think this is really important, is verse 4, which immediately follows that, because God tells them not to do that, and the reason he gives for that is this. He says, "For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly." So that's what he tells them. Why, right? He says it's not because of some genetic or ethnic or national thing, right? It's because if you do that, your children are going to serve other gods. And that's exactly what happened. Solomon is probably the most famous example of this, right? He ends up having all of these pagan wives that he takes, and he ends up building them shrines and altars and things like that, right? So it's really important that that we recognize that. Now, saying all that, right? I ultimately think that this is mostly a reactionary movement because we're especially today. There's lots of debate, a lot of tension, a lot of feelings and emotion around ethnicity and race and things like that. And I believe that this is just a hard kick against that. And some of the, I would probably find agreement with some of the people on what I would say is the overemphasization of this stuff or how they talk about it, right? And I think that ends up making a lot of people soured. Of course, that's no excuse to fall into this type of terrible way of thinking, right? Because what ends up happening here is they ended up, whereas a guy on Twitter who ended up saying something along the lines of Stephen Wolf is his name, and he's wrote basically a book on this type of thing. Is he basically said, interracial marriage isn't a sin in its essence, but it's a sin at a greater level, right? And of course, that's an insane thing to say, because that's very unbiblical, not only in the sense of what God is condemning here is he's condemning marrying into other religion groups, right? Which is what Paul talks about when he says you shouldn't be unequally yoked, about marrying someone who isn't a Christian, right? But it also completely flies in the face of our understanding of what Paul is saying in Galatians 3, which is a famous part, right? And this is something we've heard before. And it's not an absolving of ethnicity or nation, right? Like Paul is very open about, yeah, you're still a Galatian, you're still a Jew, you're still a Greek, you're still a Roman, whatever. But all of that is subsumed under a new identity in Jesus, because this is what he says in Galatians 3:28. He says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. So right there it says, yeah, but all of this ethnic stuff is of secondary and minor importance, and what is the first and primary identification that everyone has who's a Christian is that they are a Christian, right? All things, gender, ethnicity, status in society, all of that comes afterwards, right? And I think that we end up, a lot of the times, people in general, with all types of heresies on either side, ends up being very reactionary in order to fit a political agenda or angle. So that's all I wanted to say for today. I would say, if you want to do some digging on this stuff, it's good to know. Bad thought. But just in case you ever want to be able to spot it in the wild, if anyone says, I'm a kinist, then you can know exactly what type of thing they believe, right? It's about keeping their kin. They believe God has said that, we should keep our kin pure and separate from one another, right? Which is not true biblically. All right, you guys have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and I will see you guys tomorrow for our Bible study recap. Peace out.